Welcome to the Fear Files channel. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will make you think twice before exploring the old attics and basements. It's a story about how ordinary curiosity can lead to the discovery of something truly terrifying. Sit back, turn off the lights, and let's dive into this nightmare. It all started with a post on Reddit that appeared a few years ago. A user under the nickname Nathan_1999 wrote in a popular subreddit that he found something strange in the attic of his parents' house. At first, many thought it was just another hoax to collect karma, but what followed made even the most skeptical users seriously worried. Nathan, as we'll call him for convenience, was an ordinary 24-year-old kid from a small town in Oregon. He came to his parents for the weekend to help them sort out old things before the upcoming repairs. The house was old, built in the early 60s, and an incredible amount of trash had accumulated there over the decades. Nathan's parents bought this house about 15 years ago from an elderly woman who moved into a nursing home shortly after the sale. The woman lived there alone after the death of her husband, and apparently did not bother to clean herself much. When Nathan's family moved in, they tidied up the living rooms, but the attic remained untouched. They put only their boxes there, not paying much attention to what was there before them. And so that Saturday morning, Nathan went up to the attic with a flashlight and a few garbage bags. The dust was so high that he immediately began to sneeze. Old boxes, broken furniture, some magazines from the 70s were scattered everywhere. Nathan began to methodically sort through the rubble when he came across an old leather suitcase hidden behind a stack of boxes in the farthest corner of the attic. The suitcase was covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It looked very old, shabby, with metal locks that were covered with rust. Nathan tried to open it, but the locks wouldn't budge. He went downstairs, grabbed a screwdriver, and went back to the attic. After a few minutes of fussing, the locks gave way with a dull click. Inside the suitcase were several items that immediately seemed strange to Nathan. There were old photographs, some newspaper clippings, several items of women's jewelry, and, most importantly, a thick notebook with a shabby cover. Nathan took the notebook in his hands and opened the first page. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. On the first page, in an uneven, almost childish handwriting, was written, "Diary. If you're reading this, then I'm no longer there. Let at least someone know the truth about who I really was." Nathan turned the page and began to read. With each line, his horror grew. The author of the diary, who signed with the initials JM, began his entries in the year 1973. The first entries were quite ordinary, describing everyday life, working in a local factory, problems in marriage. But somewhere on the 10th page, the tone changed dramatically. JM wrote about the strange desires that began to haunt him. He described how he watched the women in the city, followed them, studied their daily routines. At first, it was just observation, a kind of unhealthy hobby. But then the fantasies became more and more gloomy and detailed. Nathan turned the pages faster and faster, and his hands began to tremble. The entries were dated in the spring of 1974, and in them JM described his first victim. He wrote about a young woman he met in a bar. The details were so graphic and disgusting that Nathan almost closed the notebook. But he continued to read as if spellbound. JM described not only the act of violence and murder itself, but also his feelings, thoughts, and how he got rid of his body. He wrote about it with frightening detachment, almost as if it were a routine job. At the end of the recording, he mentioned that he took one of her earrings as a souvenir. Nathan looked at the bottom of the suitcase. There were indeed earrings, rings, bracelets. Each item he understood, was a trophy, a souvenir from the victim. Nathan's stomach twisted at the realization of what he was holding in his hands. He went back to his diary. The next entries described the second victim, then the third. Months, sometimes more than a year, passed between the murders. J.M. wrote that he tries to control his urges, that every time he tells himself that this is the last time, but he always broke down again. What was particularly frightening was how casually the author described his double life. In some notes, he talked about family dinners, about problems at work, about going to church. And in others, literally on the next page, he described with cold accuracy how he planned the next crime. By the year 1977, 7 victims were mentioned in the diary. Nathan tried to match the dates to the newspaper clippings in his suitcase. Indeed, there were articles about missing women from their region and neighboring districts. Some disappearances have remained unsolved. Now became clear why. Jam was cautious and methodical. He never chose victims from his city. He always went to neighboring settlements. He avoided women who had close affairs or who would be immediately grabbed. He hunted the lonely, those who were on the margins of society, prostitutes, vagrants, on those whose disappearance would not cause a great resonance. In one of the records of 1978, J.M. wrote that the police began to link some of the disappearances. He described reading in the newspapers that the authorities suspected the presence of a serial criminal in the region. This did not frighten him. On the contrary, judging by the records, it even aroused him. He wrote about the feeling of superiority, that he was smarter than all these cops. Nathan noticed that over time, the recordings became more and more incoherent and chaotic. The handwriting deteriorated, blots and strikeouts appeared. Jam began to complain of health problems, chest pains. His wife apparently insisted on seeing a doctor, but he refused. The last entry in the diary was dated March 1980. J.M. wrote that he felt the end approaching. Doctors diagnosed him with a serious heart disease. He knew that time was short. In this final entry, he reflected on his life, on what he had done. But even there was no remorse, only a cold statement of facts and some curiosity about whether anyone would find this diary after his death. Nathan closed the notebook and just sat in a daze for a few minutes. Thoughts ran through my head. He held evidence from several unsolved murders, perhaps the only opportunity for the victims' families to learn the truth about what happened to their loved ones. He came down from the attic and told his parents about the find. At first, my father did not believe it, decided that it was some kind of dark joke or literary work. But when he looked at the diary, newspaper clippings, and jewelry himself, his face became serious. They decided to contact the police immediately. On the same day, the police arrived at the house. They took the suitcase with all the contents. Nathan testified, told how he found these things. The investigators took the case very seriously. They began to check the information from the diary, to compare it with unsolved cases of missing persons. In the meantime, Nathan decided to share his story on Reddit. He did not disclose all the details, did not publish photos of the diary at the request of the police, but posted general information. The reaction of the internet community was stormy. Someone doubted the authenticity of the story. Someone offered help in the investigation. Someone shared similar stories. The next few weeks were very stressful for Nathan and his family. The police conducted an investigation and identified the author of the diary. Indeed, in the house before his grandmother, from whom Nathan's parents bought a house, lived a man named Joseph Miller. He died in April 1980 of a heart attack at the age of 47. Joseph Miller was married, worked in a local factory, and was a member of the church community. Everyone who knew him described him as a quiet, introverted person, but not suspicious. After his death, the widow continued to live in the house for more than 20 years until she moved to a nursing home. She died a year after moving, never knowing with whom she had lived side by side for so many years. The police began exhuming the cases of missing women for the period from 1974 to 1980. They compared the information from the diary with the available data. Some jewelry from the suitcase was identified. Relatives of the missing women recognized the belongings of their loved ones. In total, 11 murders were described in the diary. Police were able to confirm Miller's connection to 7 of them. In the rest of the cases, there was not enough evidence, but the investigators were sure that all the crimes described in the diary were real. For the families of the victims, this news was a blow. On the one hand, they finally learned the truth about what happened to their loved ones. On the other hand, this truth was terrifying. Some of them wanted the remains of their relatives to be found, but Miller did not specify the exact burial locations. He gave only general descriptions of forests and wastelands. Nathan gave several interviews to local news channels. The story was widely publicized. Criminologists and psychologists analyzed Miller's notes, trying to understand the psychology of the serial killer. Some experts noted that the diary is a rare case of such detailed documentation of crimes by the criminal himself. But for Nathan, all this also had a personal price. He began to suffer from nightmares. Images from the diary haunted him. He felt guilty, although he understood that he was not guilty of anything. It's just that the very fact that he read these notes, touched the belongings of the murderer, knew the details of these terrible crimes, left an imprint on him. His parents also could not live quietly in the house, knowing that evidence of unsolved murders had been stored there for decades, that the person who committed these crimes lived within these walls, walked through the same rooms. They decided to sell the house and move. In one of his updates on Reddit, Nathan wrote about a conversation with a psychologist. The specialist explained to him that the feeling of guilt that he feels is a normal reaction to a traumatic event. The psychologist also noted the importance of what Nathan did by handing over the diary to the police. Thanks to his actions, the families received answers, and historical justice somehow triumphed. An interesting point that Reddit users discussed was the question of why Miller kept this diary in the first place. Why document your crimes? Create evidence against yourself. Psychologists suggest several reasons. Firstly, it is a way to systematize experience, to give meaning to one's actions. Secondly, it is a kind of trophy, a way to relive what has been done. Thirdly, it can be a manifestation of narcissism, a desire to leave a mark, to prove one's existence and significance. Miller clearly considered himself smarter than others. He was proud that he had not been caught. For him, the diary was a monument to his own cunning and cruelty. The fact that he hid it in the attic rather than destroying it before dying suggests that a part of him wanted his deeds to be discovered. Maybe he wanted fame, even if it was posthumous. The investigation also revealed interesting details about Miller's methods. He always used his own car, an old pickup truck that his wife considered just his hobby, a way to get away from family problems. Miller often went away for a whole weekend, ostensibly to fish or hunt. In fact, he hunted people. He chose victims in advance, followed them for weeks, studied their habits. Never acted impulsively. Each murder was carefully planned. He knew when and where his victim would be alone, how to approach him, how to take him away without anyone noticing. After the crime, Miller returned home behaved absolutely normally. My wife never suspected anything. In his diary, he even wrote about how he sat with his family at the dinner table immediately after another murder, and no one noticed anything unusual in his behavior. This ability to live twice is typical of organized serial killers. Nathan also found some old maps of the region among the papers in the suitcase. Pencil marks were made on them. The police suggested that these could be the burial places of the victims. They organized several search operations in these areas. 3 months after the diary was found, the police did find human remains in one of the places marked on the map. DNA analysis confirmed that this was one of Miller's victims, a young woman who disappeared in 1976. The family was finally able to bury her remains. This was both a relief and a new wave of grief for relatives. The elderly mother of the victim gave an interview in which she said that she had always hoped that her daughter was alive, that she had started a new life somewhere. Now that hope was dead, but at least she knew the truth. The story of Nathan and the found diary became a topic of discussion in forensic circles. Several documentaries and podcasts have dedicated episodes to this case. Joseph Miller's diary began to be studied as a rare example of self-documentation of a serial criminal. Some researchers compared Miller's diary with the records of other famous serial killers. Certain parallels were found in thinking, in the ways of rationalizing one's actions in the absence of real repentance. But each case is unique, and Miller, with his methodical and secretive nature, was of particular interest. Several years have passed since the discovery. Nathan gradually coped with the psychological trauma, although this story changed his outlook on life forever. He became more careful, more attentive to the people around him. He realized that evil could lurk behind the most ordinary facade. Nathan's parents sold a house. The new owners were aware of the history, but the house was completely renovated and they decided that the past was in the past. Although neighbors said that at first the new family felt uncomfortable, especially when they had to go up to the attic. In his last big post on Reddit, Nathan reflected on how many more such secrets may be hiding in old houses, attics, and basements across the country. There's so many unsolved crimes, so many families who never find out the truth about the fate of their loved ones. He also wrote that this find forced him to rethink the ideas of good and evil. Joseph Miller wasn't a demon from horror movies. He was an ordinary person with a job, a family, an everyday life. And this is perhaps the worst thing. Evil does not always look frightening. Often it looks completely normal. Reddit users continued to discuss this story for months. Some shared their findings in attics, though thankfully nothing as sinister was found. Others debated what causes people to become serial killers, the role of psychological trauma, biological factors, and social conditions. One of the discussions concerned the question of whether such diaries should be published or kept secret. On the one hand, these are important historical documents, the study of which can help prevent future crimes. On the other hand, the publication can glorify the murderer, give him the posthumous fame that he may have desired. The police decided not to publish the full text of Miller's diary. Individual excerpts were provided to researchers for scientific work, but graphic details remained confidential out of respect for the victims and their families. Nathan also raised the important question of how society deals with the legacy of such criminals. The house in which Miller lived, the street he walked, the places where he worked, all this continues to exist. People live their ordinary lives, unaware of what evil was happening next to them decades ago. In one of the comments, a user wrote that his grandmother remembers Joseph Miller. She lived on the same street and sometimes greeted him. She described him as a quiet, polite man who always nodded in response to greetings, but never stopped for long conversations. Never, not a single hint of who he really was. This banality of evil, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt called it, is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the whole story. Miller was not a monster in the classical sense. He functioned in society, fulfilled his social roles, and at the same time, he systematically killed people. The story also resonated in the professional community. A former FBI agent who specialized in catching serial killers commented on the case in an interview. He noted that Miller is a classic example of an organized serial killer and that such criminals often go unpunished unless they make a mistake or develop new investigative techniques. The agent also said that finding the diary likely closed several cold cases that could have remained unsolved forever. In the era before DNA analysis and modern forensic methods, it was extremely difficult to catch such a cautious criminal. Meanwhile, the search for the rest of the victims continued. The police conducted several more expeditions to the places marked on Miller's maps. In 2 cases, bones were found, but their condition was such that identification was impossible. Nothing was found in other marked places, although this does not mean that there is no one there. In 40 years, a lot could have changed in the landscape. Nathan received letters from several families of the victims. They thanked him for not being scared and reporting the find to the police. For them, it was at least some kind of closure, an opportunity to find out the truth after decades of uncertainty. One woman wrote that her sister disappeared in the year 1975, and she lived her whole life with a sense of guilt that she could not protect her. Now, at least, she knows that there was nothing she could do. These letters touched Nathan deeply. He realized that his find, no matter how horrific it was, had brought something important to people. Not happiness, of course, but certainty. An opportunity to close this chapter and try to move on. History has also made many people think about their own homes. How many secrets do old walls hold? What can be hidden in the unexplored corners of basements and attics? Several people on Reddit share that after this story, they decided to thoroughly check their homes, especially if they bought them from previous owners. One user said that he found an old chest in the attic with letters and photographs from the Second World War. Another discovered a hidden collection of newspapers describing a major local crime in the 1970s. Nothing as sinister as the murderer's diary, but these finds were also interesting historical artifacts. Psychologists who commented on the case noted that reading Miller's diary could have had a serious psychological impact on Nathan. This level of detail of violence, read by an untrained person, can cause symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. They advised anyone who encounters such finds to contact the police immediately and not to read further if the content causes distress. Several years passed, and public interest in history gradually faded. Nathan continued his life, but this find will forever remain a part of his story. He occasionally gave interviews when new documentaries or articles about the Miller case came out. In one such interview, Nathan said that if he could have gone back that Saturday morning, he would have opened the suitcase anyway. Because the truth, no matter how horrible, is important. Families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. The story deserves to be told. He also added that this find changed his outlook on life. He began to appreciate his loved ones more, became more attentive to the people around him. He realized how fragile life is and how important it is not to take security for granted. Joseph Miller's story is a reminder that evil can exist alongside us, hiding behind a mask of normalcy. That those who seem to be ordinary neighbors or coworkers may hold terrifying secrets. That the past does not always remain buried. Sometimes it surfaces in the most unexpected way. For criminologists and law enforcement agencies, Miller's diary has become a valuable educational material. It is studied in the academies of the FBI, used to teach detectives to understand the psychology of serial criminals. Although Miller's name has not become as famous as the names of other serial killers, his case is considered important in professional circles. As for the house where Miller lived, the new owners gradually got used to its history. They performed a kind of purification ritual, invited a priest who blessed the house. Over time, the neighbors stopped pointing their fingers at the house and whispering. Life returned to normal. But for those who know history, the house will forever remain the place where the killer lived, where he planned his crimes, where he returned after them, where he kept his terrifying diary. This knowledge cannot be erased. It is imprinted in the very structure of the building. Nathan sometimes thinks about how things would have unfolded if he hadn't found the suitcase. Maybe it would have been discovered during the next renovation many years later. Maybe the house would have been demolished and the evidence would have been destroyed forever. The families of the victims would never have known the truth. Joseph Miller would have gone to his grave, taking his secrets with him. But fate decreed otherwise. That Sabbath day changed the lives of many people. He gave answers to questions that have tormented families for decades. He brought justice, albeit belated. The story of Nathan and the diary of a serial killer shows how complex and unpredictable the world is. How an accidental find can open the door to a past full of horror. How an ordinary person can stumble upon something extraordinary and creepy. It also reminds us of the importance of paying attention, not ignoring what seems strange or suspicious. Who knows how many more unsolved crimes are waiting in the wings, hidden in old boxes and suitcases in attics around the world. With this, I conclude today's story. Remember that the truth can be hidden in the most unexpected places. And sometimes the past comes back to demand accountability for the crimes committed. Thank you for being with us on the Fear Files channel. Until the next meeting with terrifying but real stories. Interestingly, the story did not end with the simple closure of the case. A year after the diary was found, new details began to emerge, which further confused the picture. Nathan received an email from a man who introduced himself as an amateur historian researching the criminal history of their region. This man, let's call him Robert, claimed to have information that might be related to the Joseph Miller case. Robert wrote that a few years ago he was doing research in the local archives and came across a strange incident from the year 1967. Then the body of a young woman was found in the woods about 50 miles from the city where Miller lived. The circumstances of her death were similar to those described in the diary, but it was 7 years before the first murder mentioned by Miller. Nathan passed this information on to the detective who was investigating the Miller case. The detective, a seasoned professional named Thomas Henderson, took it seriously. He contacted Robert and asked for all the materials he had. Robert provided copies of newspaper articles and police reports from the archives. When Detective Henderson studied the materials, he found some really disturbing coincidences. The method of murder, the place where the body was found, the profile of the victim, all this coincided with Miller's methods. But in 1967, Miller was only 34 years old. He had recently married and was just starting his career in the factory. Did he really start killing before he wrote his diary? Henderson decided to conduct a deeper investigation into Miller's biography. He looked up all available records, school records, military archives, interviews with people who knew Miller in his youth. What he found painted an even more disturbing picture. It turned out that in adolescence, Miller showed signs of psychopathy, although it was not diagnosed then. His school teachers remembered a strange, introverted boy who tortured animals. Several classmates said that Miller was once involved in the disappearance of a neighbor's cat, although nothing could be proven. After school, Miller served in the Army for 2 years, from 1952 to 1954. His military record were mostly standard, but there was one remark from the commander that Miller showed an excessive interest in guns and violence, which even for a military man seemed unusual. After the Army, Miller returned home, got a job in a factory, and married in 1965. The early years of marriage appear to have been relatively normal, although neighbors noted that the couple rarely showed warmth to each other in public. Detective Henderson turned to old police files from the early 60s to the early 70s. He searched for unsolved cases of disappearances or murders within a 100-mile radius of Miller's residence. The results were stunning. He found 4 other cases that could potentially be related to Miller, including the same case from 1967. This meant that the diary Nathan found may not have been Miller's full confession. Either he started killing early and didn't record his early crimes, or he kept a few diaries and the rest were never found. The thought was terrifying. How many more victims could there be? Henderson returned to the diary itself and noticed that the first entry in it began quite abruptly, as if it was not the beginning of the story. Miller wrote about his desires as if he had been thinking about them for a long time. There was no period of doubt or hesitation that usually precedes the first murder in serial criminals. The detective decided to organize another check of the house where Miller lived. Despite the protests of the new owners, a search warrant was obtained. A team of forensic experts with metal detectors, special cameras, and dogs trained to find remains combed the entire house in sight. The search took 3 days. On the first day, nothing was found. On the second day, the dog showed a reaction to a certain area of the basement, but nothing was found there. Perhaps something was once there, but over the decades, the traces disappeared. On the third day, when it seemed that the search would lead to nothing, one of the forensic experts found a small metal box under the floorboards in the back room. The box was rusted but still locked. When it was opened, several more items of women's jewelry, a lock of hair in a small plastic bag, and, most importantly, several photographs were found inside. The photographs were of young women, and, judging by the quality of the pictures and the clothing, they were taken in the 50s and 60s. The police released these photos in the hope that someone would identify the women. A few days later, an elderly woman responded. She identified her older sister in one of the photographs, who had gone missing in 1963. She was 22 years old at the time, working as a waitress at a roadside diner, and one day, she just didn't come home from work. The family searched for her for years, but no traces were found. The police then assumed that she could have run away with some guy or become the victim of an accident. Now, more than 60 years later, her younger sister has learned the terrible truth. 2 more women in the photos were identified by relatives. Both disappeared in the early 60s. This supported the theory that Miller began killing much earlier than indicated in the found diary. Perhaps he destroyed the first diary or hid it elsewhere, deciding to start writing again in 1973. Nathan watched these developments with growing horror. His innocent discovery in the attic turned into the disclosure of a massive series of crimes spanning perhaps more than 20 years. He gave another interview in which he expressed shock that the story turned out to be even more terrible than it initially seemed. Detective Henderson decided to dig even deeper. He began to study the period when Miller served in the Army. Miller was assigned to a base in California, and Henderson contacted police departments in towns near that base. He asked about the unsolved disappearances of young women in 1952-53. To his surprise, there were two such cases. Both women disappeared under similar circumstances. Both were lonely, and both were last seen in bars frequented by the military. The bodies were not found. Henderson requested a list of military personnel who were at the base at the time. Joseph Miller's name was on the list. Of course, this was not direct evidence. Hundreds of people served at the base. But given everything else that was known about Miller, it looked very suspicious. Henderson began to wonder if Miller had started killing in the Army at the age of 19 or 20. If this was true, then Joseph Miller could have been responsible for the deaths of not 11 women, as indicated in the diary, but perhaps 20 or even more. He could have been one of the most prolific serial killers in American history who simply never got caught. The thought was overwhelming. Miller lived his life, died of natural causes in his bed, surrounded by a semblance of respectability. No one ever suspected him. He took his secrets to the grave, and only chance, in the form of a curious young man in the attic, revealed his true nature. The story received even more media attention. Now national newspapers and TV channels wrote about the Miller case. The documentaries have been updated with new information. Criminal psychologists analyzed the case in their publications and lectures. One prominent FBI profiler commented that the Miller case demonstrates how dangerous so-called organized serial killers can be. They are able to lead a normal life, avoid suspicion, and continue to kill for decades. They are intelligent, cautious, and patient. They do not leave evidence and do not commit impulsive actions. The profiler also noted that the discovery of the diary was an incredible success for the investigation. Most serial killers don't document their crimes in such detail. Many cold cases remain unsolved forever precisely because there's a lack of such an inner perspective. Meanwhile, relatives of potential victims began to contact the police. People whose loved ones went missing in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s in the region wanted to know if their relatives might have been victims of Miller. Detective Henderson and his team were overwhelmed with work, checking every case. A special unit was created to deal with the Miller case. It included detectives from several districts, criminologists, historians, and even volunteers. They created a huge database with all the cases of missing women in the region for the period from 1950 to 1980. The database included hundreds of cases. Of course, not all of them were associated with Miller. Many women disappeared for other reasons: accidents, other criminals, voluntary disappearance. But the team tried to filter out those cases that fit the profile of Miller's victims. They were looking for women between the ages of 18 and 35, single, often from dysfunctional families or leading marginal lives, who had disappeared under circumstances where they were quickly shortaged. There were about 50 such cases. The task now was to determine which of these 50 cases could be Miller's work. To do this, the team used all available information: the geography of the disappearances, the time frame, matches with Miller's known movements, and a physical description of the victims that matched Miller's preferences as far as could be determined from the diary. Gradually, the list was reduced to the 20 most likely cases. 20 women who may have been victims of Joseph Miller. 20 families who could finally get answers, even though many relatives had already died without knowing the truth. Police have launched new searches in places where, according to analysis, bodies may have been buried. It was a difficult task. Over the decades, the landscape has changed. Forests were cut down or thickened even more. The roads have been rebuilt. Landmarks disappeared. In addition, there was no guarantee that Miller buried all of his victims in the same places or buried them at all. Nevertheless, the team worked hard. They used old aerial photographs to understand what the area looked like in the past. They interviewed old-timers who could remember which places were deserted in those years and suitable for hiding the body. 2 years after the initial find, 3 more burials were discovered. In each case, DNA analysis confirmed that they were women from the missing list. One disappeared in 1965, another in 71, and one in 78. All of them fit the profile of Miller's victims. With each new discovery, the story became darker. Miller had been killing for at least 25 years, perhaps longer. He was a patient, methodical predator who chose victims that society would overlook or quickly forget. Nathan continued to cope with the aftermath of his discovery. He began working with an organization that helps the families of missing people. He felt that since his find had revealed this horrific story, he should do his part to help those who were affected. He spoke at conferences, telling his story and stressing the importance of not ignoring suspicious finds. He urged people who buy old houses to check them carefully, especially places that have not been used for a long time. Who knows how many more secrets are hidden in basements and attics throughout the country. Miller's widow had already died by that time, never having learned the truth about her husband. Her daughter, Miller's only child, gave one interview in which she said she was shocked and devastated. She remembered her father as a strict but not cruel person. He never showed aggression at home. He was never suspicious. She couldn't believe that the person who read her bedtime stories was a monster. Miller's daughter changed her surname and moved to another state. She refused further contact with the media. It was an unbearable burden for her to know that her father was a serial killer. She went through intensive therapy trying to cope with this revelation. Psychologists who worked with her noted that the children of serial killers often suffer from a complex set of emotions: shock, denial, shame, guilt by association, grief over the loss of the image of the parent they thought they knew. This is a special type of injury that requires specialized care. The public was divided in its attitude towards Miller's daughter. Some sympathized with her, realizing that she was an innocent victim of circumstances. Others wondered if she didn't know something, if she didn't see signs that she ignored. But there was no evidence that she or her mother knew anything. This raised an interesting question. How can a person so effectively hide his true nature from even the closest people? Psychologists explain that serial killers are often masters of compartmentalization. They are able to completely separate different aspects of their personality, not allowing them to intersect. For Miller, his role as father and husband was one person. His role as a killer was completely different, which he wore when he went on his fishing and hunting trips. These two personalities did not mix. At home, he was Joseph Miller, an ordinary worker. When hunting, he became someone else, a predator living his dark fantasies. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Detective Henderson wasn't going to stop until all possible cases had been verified. He became obsessed with the Miller case, working overtime while ignoring other things. His colleagues began to worry about him, but Henderson felt personally responsible to the victims. He said in an interview that each identified victim is a small victory for justice. That even if the perpetrator is dead and cannot be punished, it is important to restore the truth, to give names to the nameless victims, to return to the families of their loved ones, at least in memory. 3 years after Nathan's initial discovery, Henderson's team released a full report on the Miller investigation. According to the report, Miller was responsible for the murder of at least 18 women, possibly 23. The crimes covered the period from 1952 to 1980. This made Miller one of the most prolific serial killers in Pacific Northwest history, although he remained relatively unknown to the general public compared to figures such as Ted Bundy or Gary Ridgway. Perhaps because Miller died long before his crimes were solved, there was no trial that attracted media attention. The report also contained a psychological profile of Miller, compiled from his diary and other documents. Profile described him as a high-functioning psychopath with narcissistic traits, a lack of empathy, and a need for control and dominance. His murders were not impulsive acts of rage for him, but carefully planned events that gave him a sense of power and satisfaction. Nathan received a copy of the report. Reading it, he relived the feelings of horror and disgust that he had experienced when he first found the diary. But now added to these feelings is something else of satisfaction that his actions have led to the revelation of the truth, to the answers for the families of the victims. He realized that this story would be with him for the rest of his life, that he will forever remain the person who found the diary of a serial killer in the attic. And although sometimes he wished he had never opened that suitcase, deep down he knew that he had done the right thing. Because the truth, no matter how gloomy, is always better than ignorance. Because the victims deserve to be remembered, to have their names restored. Because justice, even if it is belated and incomplete, still matters. The story of Nathan and Joseph Miller's diary gradually began to take on new, unexpected twists. For years after the discovery, when it seemed that the investigation was coming to its logical conclusion, something happened that stirred up the whole case again. An elderly woman named Margaret Wilson turned to the police. She was in her late 90s and lived in a nursing home in a neighboring state. She saw a documentary about the Miller case on TV and recognized it in old photographs. Margaret claimed to have known Joseph Miller as a young man, even before he served in the Army. Detective Henderson, who had already retired but continued to advise on the case, went to see Margaret in person. What she told me threw new light on the formation of Miller's personality and explained some of the mysteries of his psychology. Margaret said she grew up in the same neighborhood as Miller. They went to the same school, although she was a grade younger. She remembered him as a strange, quiet boy who always kept to himself. But the most important thing she remembered was his mother. Miller's mother, according to Margaret, was an extremely religious woman with mental problems. She was obsessed with the idea of sin and purity. Neighbors heard her reading the Bible for hours in a loud voice, often in the middle of the night. She beat her son for the slightest offenses, believing that she was beating the devil out of him. Miller's father, by contrast, was a virtually absent figure. He worked as a trucker and was not at home for a long time. When he returned, he was usually drunk and violent. Margaret remembered seeing the bruises on young Joseph's face one day and saying he had fallen off his bike. But everyone knew the truth. But the most terrible discovery was yet to come. Margaret said that when Miller was 14 years old, his mother died under mysterious circumstances. Officially, this was recognized as an accident. She allegedly fell down the stairs and broke her neck. But Margaret remembered the rumors that were circulating at that time. Some neighbors suspected that she had been pushed. Miller was at home alone with his mother at the time. My father was on a voyage. The teenager told police that he heard screaming and crashing, ran out of his room, and saw his mother lying at the foot of the stairs. Police found no signs of struggle or violence and closed the case as an accident. Henderson was shocked by this information. If Miller did kill his mother at the age of 14, it would have completely changed the timeline of his crimes. This meant that his first murder did not take place in the Army or in the early 60s, but much earlier, and the victim was his own mother. Henderson asked to raise all documents related to the death of Miller's mother. The case was closed more than 70 years ago, but the records have been preserved in the archives. After reviewing them, Henderson found several disturbing details that the police of the time either ignored or did not consider important. First, witnesses reported that the relationship between Miller and his mother was extremely strained. Neighbors heard loud quarrels. Secondly, the school teacher noted that in the last months before his mother's death, Miller's behavior changed. He became even more withdrawn, but there was something anxious in his eyes, a kind of cold determination. Thirdly, and most importantly, the coroner noted in his report that the nature of the fractures was unusual. He wrote that falling downstairs usually causes a certain pattern of injuries, but in this case there were some inconsistencies. However, in the absence of other evidence, and with a simple explanation, the case was closed. Of course, after so many years, it was impossible to prove the murder. The body was buried long ago, the witnesses are dead, the evidence has long disappeared. But for understanding Miller's psychology, this discovery was critically important. It showed that his path as a killer did not begin in adulthood, but in adolescence, and the first victim was the man who caused him pain and suffering. Psychologists who analyzed the case noted that the murder of his mother tormentor could have been a formative experience for Miller. He felt absolute power over life and death. He got rid of the source of his suffering and in doing so escaped punishment. This may have given him a sense of invulnerability and superiority that fueled his subsequent crimes. After the death of his mother, Miller lived with his father for another year until he graduated from school. His father died a few years after Miller joined the Army of cirrhosis of the liver. Miller did not come to the funeral. He had no family left except for the one he created himself by getting married. This new information added another tragic chapter to the story of Joseph Miller. He was not born a monster. He was made so by circumstances, abuse, lack of love and support. But at some point, he made a choice to deal with his pain by hurting others. And this choice determined his entire future life. However, this was not an excuse for his actions. Many people go through a violent childhood and do not become serial killers. But it helped to understand how such a personality is formed, what factors contribute to the development of psychopathy and a tendency to violence. Nathan, having learned about this new turn, thought about the nature of evil. He realized that Miller's story was not just a story about one evil man. This is a story about the cycle of violence, about how cruelty begets cruelty, how traumatized children can become traumatic adults. Almost 5 years have passed since the diary was found. The investigation was officially closed. All possible cases were checked. All the evidence found was analyzed. The final number of Miller's victims remains unknown, but police have linked him to at least 19 murders. 19 women whose lives were cut short by one man. 19 families who didn't know the truth for decades. Some of the relatives died without knowing what happened to their loved ones. Others lived to see the moment when they finally received answers. For these families, the discovery of a diary was of great importance. One woman, whose sister disappeared in 1975, said in an interview that she felt in limbo all her life. She could neither mourn her sister nor hope for her return. Now that she had learned the truth, she was finally able to let go of the past and move on with her life. Detective Henderson, completing his work on the case, wrote a book about the investigation. The book was called Diary of a Monster: The Unsolved Case of Joseph Miller. It became a bestseller, attracted even more attention to the case. Henderson gave a significant part of the fee to organizations that helped the families of the missing. In the book, Henderson described the entire investigation process in detail, from the first call from Nathan to the final report. It also included a psychological analysis of Miller's personality based on a diary and interviews with specialists. The book has become an important resource for law enforcement and criminal psychologists. Nathan wrote the foreword to the book. In it, he told us part of the story and shared his thoughts on how this find changed his life. He wrote that he would never forget the moment when he opened the diary and realized what he was holding in his hands. It was like looking into the abyss of the human soul and seeing absolute darkness there. But he also wrote that this story taught him to appreciate life and the people around him, that she showed him the importance of telling the truth, no matter how difficult it may be, that sometimes one person, having made the right choice, can change the fate of many. The house where Miller lived was eventually demolished. The new owners could not cope with the psychological burden of living in the place where the serial killer lived. The plot was sold, and a new house was built on it. But the locals still remembered what had happened here before. A small memorial to the victims of Miller was erected in the city. It was a simple granite slab engraved with the names of 19 women whose connection to Miller's crimes had been established. Under the names was the inscription, "We remember. We will never forget." The opening of the memorial was attended by relatives of the victims, police representatives, Nathan, and Detective Henderson. It was a solemn and sad ceremony. People cried, hugged each other, shared memories of lost loved ones. Nathan made a short speech. He said he hoped the memorial would be a reminder not only of the victims, but also of the importance of attention to those who are disappearing. That too often society ignores the disappearance of people who are on the sidelines, considering them unworthy of searching. That every life matters, and every disappearance deserves a thorough investigation. Years passed. The story of Miller's diary gradually faded from the headlines. New sensations, new stories appeared. But for those directly affected, this story will never end. Nathan continued to work with organizations that help families of missing persons. He became an advocate for the case, calling for better systems for registering and searching for missing people. He often said that if the police had taken the disappearances of single women more seriously in the 1970s, perhaps Miller would have been caught sooner and some lives would have been saved. Detective Henderson also did not stop after the investigation was completed. He began advising police departments across the country on cold cases, using the experience gained from working on the Miller case. He helped solve several more old cases, returning answers to families decades later. Miller's daughter never went public again. She lived a quiet life under a new name, trying to cope with the burden of being the child of a serial killer. Her therapist said she was making good progress, but some wounds never healed completely. And the suitcase with the diary and evidence is now stored in the police archives in a sealed box marked evidence. The case is closed. Sometimes it's taken out for research purposes When crime students or psychology students want to study a real-life example of serial killer documentation, everyone who reads this journal leaves the room changed. Because this is not fiction for entertainment. These are the real words of a real person about real crimes. It is a look into the mind of someone for whom human life had no meaning. 10 years after the discovery, Nathan gave his last big interview about the case. The journalist asked him if he regretted opening that suitcase. Nathan was silent for a long time, pondering his answer. Then he said, there's a part of me that wished it had never known what was there, who would like to continue to live in ignorance. But I realized that the truth is not something you can run away from. She will always find a way to get out, and it's better to face it than to let it rot in the shadows. He continued, these women deserve to have their story told. Their families deserved answers. And if my find helped to restore justice at least a little, then it was worth it, even with all the nightmares and pain. The journalist also asked what Nathan thought of Joseph Miller as a person. Nathan replied, I think he was living proof that evil exists, not in a metaphysical sense, but in a very real human sense. He has made the choice to inflict pain over and over again for decades. And no difficult childhood justifies this. He was a monster, but a human monster. And that's probably the worst thing. At the end of the interview, Nathan said something that summed up this whole incredible story. We live in a world where addicts keep secrets, where people who seem normal can hide a terrifying darkness, where justice sometimes comes decades after the crime. This is a frightening reality, but it's also a reminder that the truth always matters, that the memory of the victims is important, that we must be vigilant, attentive, and ready to face the darkness when we discover it. And with that, the story of finding the diary of a serial killer in the attic comes to an end. A story that began with an ordinary guy sorting through old boxes in his parents' house and turned into the disclosure of one of the most disturbing cases of serial murder in American history. 19 lives were cut short. Hundreds of people were affected. Relatives, friends, investigators, those who knew Miller. And they all now carry this story with them, a reminder of the fragility of life and the presence of evil in the world. But it is also a story about the importance of truth, about the power of one person who made the right choice, about the fact that justice, even if incomplete, is still possible, and that the memory of the victims is alive as long as someone is ready to tell their story. Thank you for being with us on the Fear Files channel. Remember, sometimes the most horrific stories are those that happen in real life, behind the closed doors of ordinary homes, in the lives of people who seem completely normal. Be attentive to the world around you. Don't ignore what seems strange. And never forget that the truth, no matter how scary it is always better than a lie. It was a story about a find in the attic that changed everything. A story about the diary of a serial killer, 19 lost lives, and a long road to justice. See you in the next issue of Fear Files, where we continue to explore the darkest corners of human nature and the most mysterious stories that make us think about the boundaries between good and evil.